extend my greetings to all the participants of the panel, the presenters, and also the audience. The panel is entitled The New Globalization and Countering Populism. In the role of moderator, I can lean back a bit, I hope, and listen. I'm particularly interested in how the participants weighed the advantages and disadvantages of globalization and how they grasp the multilateral, even iridescent concept of populism, for which there is still no clear consensus definition and which still represents a kind of fuzzy or even catch-all concept. And I'm personally interested in what the speakers have to say, as I'm currently writing an article on the role of populism in development countries, particularly in transition countries, for solving what I have called in another paper article in what I called the political economic trilemma, that is the simultaneous achievement of A, the goal of catching up fast, B, the goal of stability, and C, the goal of preservation of power. Well, I think we have 3 presenters in this panel still. Is this right? I hope so. The first is Oscar MAZZOLENI, a political scientist from the University of Lausanne. The second is Michael Lee from CUNY-Hunter College in New York. And the third will be Marcus TAUBE from the East Institute at the University of Duisburg-Essen. You know the given time constraints, 20 minutes for each presenter. With that, I'll give the stage to the first presenter, Oscar MAZZOLENI. Here you go.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. Sorry, I tried to do that. I open my, I hope this is possible to share. Yes, okay. So thank you very much. My presentation is on populism, of course, on a specific dimension of populism, economic aspect of populism in connection with the 2 specific goals. The first, it tried to illustrate how the successful radical right of extreme right populist parties in Europe is related to economic aspects, and the second goal is to develop a framework of analysis from a political science perspective. Of course, the relation between populism and economy is very complex. I'm not an economist. I'm not a representative of political economy, and I think that's really important to distinguish. So some scholars focus on the material economic condition, enhancing populist responses or grievances in terms of course, economic crisis, socio-economic frustration, the impact of inflation, unemployment rates, etc. There are scholars, they focus on public policies, socio-economic, public policies developed by populist actors. Of course, in this aspect, we can find neoliberal or protective or protectionist public policies. Of course, this is very also relevant. My focus is a bit different. It's different because I look at the discourses by actors, but also attitudes, social psychological attitudes by citizens. So in this sense, I look at the ideational and moral content of populist grievances. We have, in this sense, looking on what the populists tell, what the narratives of populists, and how these narratives can convince, to some extent, voters, citizens, to support this kind of parties. And of course, populism is a very open concept, very vague at the same time. There are many distinctions. I have no time to, of course, to discuss now in the presentation of which kind of populism we have to discuss. But here, I think I took this definition, just provisional, just to discuss about that. I think I take this definition in 3 times. So this definition would consider three components: the centrality of the man on the street, the sovereign people, defined as a sovereign people, so as the ultimate holder of democratic legitimacy. This is the first dimension. The second dimension is the critique toward the representative democracy and the elites accused to having betrayed the interests of the people and, of course, sovereignty. And the third dimension is the claim for, again, the betrayed sovereignty and the power of the people, and an inspiration to a profound renewal of the political system. This is 3 dimension. Of course, not every political parties and actors develop a discourse combining all these dimensions, but in general, this is, I think, very relevant. And if you want to go in depth, in a specific way, in economic dimension of this general frame, we can focus not just on the power of the people, but the fact that we talk about the economic community, the prosperity, a common destiny of the people around their own material prosperity. So a narrative emphasizing the material well-being and the prosperity of the people who is presented as in decline or in danger. And the second aspect, of course, this prosperity perceived as in danger is seen as ignored or betrayed by the elites. And the third dimension, of course, is when we want to reconquest, recover the prosperity, that means also to regain the sovereignty of the people. So this is overlapping between prosperity and sovereignty of the people. And in connection with this three aspect, I focus on two concepts, specific concepts. One is the producerism, concept of producerism. Is a long story, intellectual story of this concept. I have no time here to develop. And sovereignism. And producerism is used for many, especially U.S. scholars, to working on right-wing populism. And this concept is based on the idea that there are some two specific components in the society. One is the producers, which contribute to the prosperity of the community, and the other side there is a kind of parasites, so people or not people unable to contribute. In this sense, there are no right to be part of the people. So producerism is this narrative opposing to these two in antagonist way, the people and the rest, the not producers in the society. And this is interesting because when populism in terms of economy define the people, what the true people is in terms of in terms of economics, is based on this idea of producers. So the people, the real people, are the producers. And the other side, when you have to talk about what the people are, they are sovereign, but they are sovereign about what? They're sovereign about their own destiny, their own prosperity in specific. And when we want to restore this betrayed prosperity, we have this idea of to reconquest the sovereignty. Sovereignism is a claim, is not just an institution, it's a claim, a message of nostalgia for the good old days by referring to an idealized period of when the people enjoy economic well-being. This is the idea we need to restore the old and the best moment of the history under our life, etc. These two narratives, producer and sovereignty, is part of this dimension, economic dimension of populism. And in order to illustrate how it works, because it can be just an intellectual speculation, but what we have to do with my colleague Gilles Valdy from Sciences Po Paris, we have worked on the one side of the discourse by the actors, political actors in Europe, and on the other side among citizens and voters. And here I do just two cases: France, member of the European Union, and another country not member of European Union but part of the Schengen Treaty, as Switzerland. And we have worked on a survey. I have not just time to develop here. We can discuss it if you have interest. But we conduct a original comparative survey with our own questionnaire based on this concept of sovereignism and producerism. And we examine how this dimension could work, could influence of finally the behavior of the people in front of this kind of right-wing populist parties. And in this sense, we are trying to show that the respondents are in fact consistently connected with this kind of attitudes, convinced by this opposition between producer and parasite, convinced that we need to reconquest sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and we show with a statistical analysis that is effective in this survey and this specific representative samples. And of course, how we can define concretely producers, we try to submit it to the people, to a representative sample of people, a kind of items on which they have to consider they are disagree or not disagree. The first item is the general economic welfare of this country, of our countries as it decline. So this is perception, a judgment of the people. The second is today in our country, many economic decisions are taken without taking in account the interest of the people. And in this country, they don't really care about the hard-working people, expressing the common expression of the producers. In this sense, we test the idea of the producer. We test also the idea of the sovereignism. About, of course, the government of this country does not really care about the living standard of the people. So it is not just the government working with external powers or not care about the people, but the living standard of people, specifically on economic dimension. And then this international trade agreement diminish the sovereignty of our country. Again, our government does not its best to defend the interest of our country in the world that's more general. And of course, this dimension of the coming back of economic sovereignty, so the sovereignism, is also focused on the citizens should have a greater say in the decision of that matter of a country. So the idea of that populism is not just a grievance, just an expression of criticism, is the volunteer of the willing to change something, to change strongly, and this idea to our country should better protect itself from external economic pressures. So the idea to change the system, to transform the system in order to respond to this narrative, of course. And we show with this analysis that independently from many other aspects, so we put under control gender, age, education. So independently of many aspects of factors are, of course, which are very important in explaining right-wing populist voting behavior. We consider also this dimension. We show that it's a significant impact, independently of the right-wing scale, about welfare chauvinism, the perception and the judgment about redistribution, the perception of the globalization. Of course, they have no time to develop here, but the cultural threat of immigration also, independently from all the aspects, this specific dimension of combining this idea of producers plus sovereignism as a real impact or significant impact in the two countries, so both in France and in Switzerland. And just to conclude, I think it's important that we consider the specificity of the economic populism. So economic populism is not just a broad general idea of populism, but a specific conception in terms of economic dimension, not just the external impact, because of course socio-economic crisis is very important to explain this, the success of this kind of parties, but also the narratives, the discourses of these parties, the leaders of this party are very relevant in terms of economic proposals, and not just public policies, but the idea, the value, the moral discourse underlying the general message of this part. Economic dimension, of course, as I said, take different forms. Here, I just presented a focus on the citizens, a citizen approach, demand-side approach, the set of attitudes that play a significant role in explaining electoral support for this grinding populist party in Europe. And at the same time, of course, as I said, we focus on the analysis of discourses by the actors on party platform, for instance, electoral platform. We are working now on the Facebook also, and then that would be an important point. If we want to take seriously in account why these parties are successful in Europe, and not only in Europe, we have really to see and to check and to focus also on the messages and not just the external and internal. Of course, we can have an important analysis about the factor in terms of age, gender, many other aspects, socioeconomic factors, educational aspect, but these are not really connected with the message, specific message, the ideological supply of this party. And thinking we have to take really in consideration this aspect in also in economic dimension in order to understand the success of these parties. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Oscar. You have still 5 minutes left, but okay, at least you have saved us 5 minutes, the panel, because we were still late. Okay, then I think we will proceed with the second speaker, Michael Lee.
Thank you, Helmut, and thank you, Oscar, for a great presentation, and thank you, Ibrahim, for organizing this whole event. Although I noticed it's interesting to hear different people saying, you know, I'm not sure how to define populism, the quintessential question. There was actually in 1968 there was a symposium. All kinds of luminaries like Isaiah Berlin were there. They couldn't figure it out back then as well. So anyways, my presentation, my talk is entitled Populism or Embedded Plutocracy, the Emerging World Order. So I'd like to sort of discuss a few things here. First, it's the question of how populists govern. So in other words, do populists really govern in ways that are different from non-populist parties? What I'm trying to do here is present a model that could help us understand the ways that populists choose different kinds of political choices. And in particular, I actually understand populism. I argue that to understand populism, you have to really understand the leaders of populist movements. And also, I should note, by populism, I'm sort of closer to the mood definition of populism as an ideology. I actually don't like the thin-centered part of his definition, but as an ideology that presents politics as being informed by a Manichaean conflict between elites and the people, the elites being corrupt, the people being virtuous, but also noting, and this is, I think, the point of scholars like Muller, that populists often define the people in a narrow way. So some of the people don't count as some of the people. And in that sense, populism could be usefully understood as existing along a spectrum where the opposite of populism could be, in a sense, it could be elitism, but it also could be, and more commonly, it is going to be pluralism. Right. So I would think of a pluralist as somebody who believes that the nature of politics is, well, and you have lots of different groups, they want different things, and naturally they're going to compromise. Right. I think that would be very much the opposite of a populist view. And secondly, I try to apply this model of populism as a mode of governance led by elites for their own purposes to the world stage, to understand how both populist interactions on the world stage and also populist non-populist interactions on the world stage might reshape world order. Because if we look at the world today, right, we have more and more countries that are electing populist governments. In the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, right, one of the great challenges, the great crises of the 21st century, you had arguably populist governments in many of the great powers, right? The United States, in Britain, in Italy, in Brazil, all simultaneously. And so when you have lots of governments of a particular stripe at the same time, you have not just the question of what kind of foreign policy do they have, but also what kind of vision of world order might happen if they represent a kind of cohesive pole within international relations. So first, let's go within countries. So liberal democracies are good at generating broad-based public goods that are widely spread because they have governments that require the consent of a broad swath of the populace, right? In order to win an election, you need to win a lot of votes. Or if we're talking about a parliamentary democracy, right, maybe you're forming a coalition with a group of parties that collectively rely on probably a majority of society. And simultaneously, they have courts, they have rules and other institutions that push governments towards providing goods in a very broad-based way, right? Widely distributed public goods, rules against discrimination, right? In the United States, where I'm speaking from right now, for instance, you have things like the Civil Rights Act, which prevents discrimination. Moreover, in a country with a dense civil society, many people are going to have broad cross-cutting social cleavages. And that is going to make it very hard for politicians of any political stripe to engage in policy that is very narrowly targeted, right? Policies that distribute resources exclusively to those that are likely to vote for them. And so that creates a kind of virtuous political competition where leaders are trying to compete by being more competent at delivering broad-based public goods to the people. I would argue increasingly since the financial crisis, in particular, populist governments have started to take power. And this poses a challenge, right? Because in many ways, populism may mean something differently from the level of voters and elites, right? There's been lots of really excellent work done at the level of surveys to try to understand the populist voter. But I think in some ways there's something that you miss with that approach, although it's certainly very, very essential and very, very useful. So for voters, populist attitudes may be deeply felt, as are their attachments to different identity groups that may inform notions of the people, right? And that story might differ in different countries, right? For in the United States, right, you will hear Sarah Palin a few years ago gave a speech talking about real America, but real America is really white Christian America. It's not people in big cities like me here in New York. Right, we're part of the liberal cosmopolitan elite, swirling our glasses of wine and looking down at flyover country in that narrative. So in that sense, the idea of populism is thin may differ. I think populism is thin at the level of elites that are using it as a strategy to win elections. I don't think it's thin necessarily at the level of voters. As well, voters are often ill-informed and use heuristics to understand politics. That can make them very easily manipulated by populist politicians. And so in that sense, the search for the populist voter may not always be as rewarding in trying to understand what populism really is, right? We think about Trump, for instance. If you looked at who voted for him in 2016, the overlap between who voted for Romney in 2012 was very, very high, even though Trump and Romney differed substantially in their views and certainly their degree of populism. So on the other hand, I argue that for elites, populist rhetoric is a useful way to serve their own goals. Liberal democracy is bad for elites. It forces societies towards the provision of broad-based public goods. But liberal democracy is also rife with opportunities for attack. Right? Let's think of some of the ways that liberal democracies, and to a degree, really almost all societies deliver these public goods. Well, you have, if a government tramples on minority rights, the place often you would go to would be the courts, right? Judges are going to defend minority rights. There also are pragmatic things that are happening in government, right? We probably don't want to have to give governments direct control over monetary policy, right? Often we delegate control over monetary policy to central bankers who are experts. In a pandemic, we might want to listen to public health experts, perhaps. We might have fewer people die from communicable diseases if we do that. However, this creates a scenario where often politicians can delegate authority over unpopular decisions to some of these external bodies, right? I mean, we just had a speech from Commissioner Jourova, who is probably who represents, one of the quintessential institutions of that nature, right? The European Council is probably the most popular piñata politically for people around the world, at least in Europe. And so both the practical and pragmatic side of complex governments involves deference to experts or involves deference to processes that are often inscrutable to voters. And that presents a huge opportunity for elites, or at least a subset of elites, to try to exploit those vulnerabilities in order to gain power. Because at the end of the day, providing public goods broadly is not efficient politically, right? If I want to win elections, what I really want to do is I want to get as small a base as possible, and I want to distribute as many goods as possible to people within my base so that they will be very, very loyal to me. Right? We could think of goods here both materially, but also in terms of policy concessions. I want a coalition, a winning coalition that is just big enough for me to maintain the levers of power if I am a political leader. So populism is then centered among elites, but not among the people. And let's consider a hard case here, right? So we have many different populist parties. There's differing levels to which they may have been committed to populism. I think you could argue that Cinque Stelle in Italy is probably the closest thing to an explicitly populist party. And yet even there, they even went so far as to implement this voting system that they called Rousseau, where party members could decide what party policy would be. Yet even in Cinque Stelle, right, the party has never really been transparent about the functioning of Rousseau. People that have done investigations have found numerous manipulations of Rousseau by party leaders. The whole system was managed by a private entity, by this enigmatic party guru named David Casaleggio. Right, so even and often Rousseau produced voting decisions that did not seem to follow the preferences of five-star voters, right? In different points, for instance, they backed a coalition government with Mario Draghi, who you would think would be kind of the arch nemesis of the five-star movement. So why cultivate? So in other words, even in the most populist party, it doesn't quite seem that the populism is really what is driving the decisions that are being made. So why cultivate a small, intensely loyal base? I argue that the benefit of doing that for leaders is that opens up more opportunity for rent seeking. It means that in the face of policy failures, they will face much less backlash from the supporters they need in order to win elections. If you have a major scandal, right, they will be able to maintain their voter base. I mean, just yesterday, right, we had the indictment of Donald Trump. I suspect that his support base within the Republican Party, if anything, has gone up and not down as a result of that indictment of him for allegedly paying hush money to a porn star, right? And he's representing the party of family values. So in other words, I argue that essentially populism could be understood as a tool by which to craft a narrow but very loyal base of support. And what kinds of tools would that involve? Well, that would involve something like a kind of welfare chauvinism, right? So replacing broad-based arguments, right? So on the right, you maybe used to have more neoliberal politicians who are arguing for this idea that free markets would be a rising tide that would lift all boats. Instead, here we're talking about shifting towards a different narrative about shrinking the size of the state more by excluding minority groups, by excluding people who are not part of the legitimate people for a particular populist party. And so this can help us explain a number of things about populist parties. First, populist parties are unusually corrupt, whether we're talking about Orban and his patriotic cohort of businessmen. Italy has just a litany of wonderful examples from Berlusconi, who had a litany of trials, but also if you look at the Northern League, right, from Bossi to Salvini, there are a number. Or whether you're talking about Trump in the United States, but also among the Brexiteers, you have this tendency as well. So how do populist parties survive? They survive by maintaining the Manichaean divisions that animate their parties between the people and not the people. They may innovate and adapt the precise contours of that, but this is core to how they stay in office. At the elite level, the goal is not a genuine interest in populism, and often it's not even in the idea that populists have a more important thick agenda, I think is often not necessarily true, right? We see a lot of inconsistency in policy among populist leaders. Viktor Orban was once the vice president of Liberal International, right? He entered politics as the leader of a liberal youth party in the early days of Hungarian democracy. Nayib Bukele, the populist leader of El Salvador who trades crypto, came out of the political left within El Salvador. Donald Trump in 2000 advocated a wealth tax in his abortive campaign to lead the Reform Party. So I think the thick agendas may not be really where the meat is. Rather, the goal is to stay in power even amidst policy failures. Right? If you look at, say, Trump or Bolsonaro, they lost, it's true, but they lost quite narrowly in a setting where hundreds of thousands of people in their countries had died from a pandemic and in fairly bad economic conditions. And some of my separate research, I found that if you look at the pandemic, excess deaths were not only higher in populist-led countries, but they were higher even if you control for the degree of response. So if populists had an aggressive response, they still, relative to other countries having an aggressive response, they had more deaths. So how does this play out at the world stage? Populists are not inherently isolationist, although on average, I would argue that they incline in that direction. But partly this is a function of the international system that they are operating in. Most are emerging in the world's democracies and are deeply embedded in a liberal world order. But world orders do not necessarily have to be liberal. If we look historically, we can see other world orders that have existed, right? In the 19th century in Europe, you had the Congress of Vienna, which arguably was a conservative world order built by the victors of the Napoleonic Wars. And second, some of the aspects of economic disengagement that populists have are compatible with populist goals, right? So maybe populists want less immigration on average, and protectionism might be something that populists on average might be inclined towards given their clientelistic goals. But some other goals of populists may not necessarily be incompatible with an open global economy. I think rather it's sort of a third angle that is often where a populist world order, a world order with more populists, is likely to be one that is less integrated and less open. One of the important ways in which our present world order facilitates cooperation is through lots of large organizations and international cooperation at the institutional level, the rules-based liberal order. And that's just the perfect bugbear for populists to attack, right? I mean, let's consider, for instance, what happens when there's a financial crisis. You have a financial crisis. One of the most important things that the United States does is that the Federal Reserve opens up swap lines and offers to provide dollars on demand to other countries. This is very important for preventing a larger financial collapse. But think of the politics of that at the level of voters, right? The government is giving money to foreigners to stop a banking crisis. That is not a very easy line for politicians to defend.
5 minutes.
Okay. So populist leaders are less likely to cooperate via formal institutions, but there are lots of ways in which they could cooperate and have been cooperating via informal connections. Because the presence of a leader with the ability and the desire to make personal deals can expand the range of potential agreements with different actors, right? You saw Trump was kind of a prolific negotiator of this kind, sending Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, around the world to do all kinds of things. But you also see this with other populist leaders. And then secondly, international policy can be a useful way for populist leaders to accentuate the cleavages that animate their parties. And indeed, if you look at the level of alignment, right, you can see different patterns. The right-wing populist parties have tended to, with some exceptions, like in Poland, have tended to advocate a pro-Russian position. Some to the extent, right, the Austrian Freedom Party leader got caught up in the Ibiza affair, where he was basically begging for Russian intervention in the election. On the left, in the Latin American Pink Tide, a pro-China orientation and sort of an anti-American orientation has also animated some of their politics. But so my point is that to understand how populists are going to function on the world stage, it's useful to understand populism as a strategy, by at least within populist parties, to try to protect themselves from electoral consequences. So thank you all, and I look forward to hearing from some of the other presenters.
Thank you, Michael, for the interesting lecture. I think we can directly proceed with the third speaker, Marcus TAUBE.
Yeah, welcome everybody. No Q&A for the other presentations. I've seen there had been something in the chat for Oscar, but Helmut Wagner, you are the chief here. You organize the whole thing. But okay, we can have the Q&A afterwards, huh?
You have 20 minutes, and that's it.
Okay.
You have slides?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Oh gosh. Okay, so here we go. So thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to introduce some ideas here. There's already been some really super interesting and inspiring input today and yesterday, and I was wondering how to connect my contribution. But perhaps let's put it this way. I mean, I would like to talk a little bit on populism on the world stage and the way the Chinese elites are promoting their case in a global setting. And I mean, it's a fascinating thing how the Communist Party, as the Chinese elite, is playing this populist card, and it's playing it very well, I think, in the domestic arena as well as on the global stage. You might have seen that yesterday, Ms. von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has made a seminal speech on the relationship between Europe and China in the coming years, which was very clear in the tone. While asking for dialogue and exchange, it was very clear in setting out the confrontational setup we have seen, and very clear in pushing China back in its support of Russia in the war in Ukraine. But we may also go back and connect the whole thing with China's reaction to the Trump agenda. Trump was pushing China back, trying to push China back from the global economic system, introducing a new type of protectionist America First policy, which was clearly directed against China. And well, he started something like a populist retreat of the United States from the global economy, and especially from East Asia. And China was the Chinese elite, the Communist Party was taking some years in its response how to deal with that. And on first sight, it looks as if China was going the same way, retreating from the global system, talking about decoupling, talking about dual circulation, which is in principle an import substitution strategy. But I think if we look a little bit deeper, then we realize the Chinese answer to the new America, the new American policies vis-a-vis China, and perhaps also the new policies coming from the EU towards China, are not a populist retreat from the global system, but rather the invention of something which you may call a populist multilateralism. And that is actually what the idea I would like to introduce today. I called that the Chinese hub and spoke multilateralism and the notion of populist economic policy. Oops. Well, here we go. Well, let's simply start with what is happening here. Wait a sec. Okay. The starting point is just Western qualitative multilateralism. And following Cafarena, I would simply highlight three key features. It's based on shared principles. Okay, so members of such a multilateralist group are sharing principles, rules, a common understanding of how the world should be. So it's normative. We have a perceived indivisibility of the group, insofar as they are understanding that the challenge, the reason why they are united, is a joint public good which is being created, be it climate change, be it peace, whatever. And third point, or the third feature, is that we have something like called diffuse reciprocity. That means the gains achieved out of this multilateral endeavor cannot be individualized and allocated on an individual basis, but it's a diffuse payoff where in the long run everybody is profiting, and in the long run everybody will reach higher levels of utility, and that's fine. Okay, and this diffuse payoff is accepted for the higher goal. Of course, this kind of thing can only work on the basis of trust in shared joint interests, and the trust that these joint goals can be achieved and will be achieved in the longer run. So that implies that we have partners which are united by a strong set of shared values, and this set of shared values is expected to become even stronger in the run of their cooperation in this group, in this multilateral setting. So this is the Western understanding, or the Western understanding of qualitative multilateralism. This is our notion in the Western world how it should be done. But China has devised something different. They've devised something which they call true multilateralism. I mean, the word per se is already a message. So it's true multilateralism. And that is quite different. It's got a very fundamental understanding insofar as that there is no other shared value basis but the UN Charter. So it does not go beyond the standards which have been defined in the Westphalian treaties. Yeah, it's very, very fundamental. We have sovereign equality and self-determination, non-interference in the state's domestic affairs, and disputes must be settled peacefully. Nothing about shared values, simply the understanding that in your own fiefdom, you're king. Yeah, that's where you can do whatever you like, and nobody is allowed to interfere from the outside and bring in any super imposed values or norms. That implies global affairs should be managed by dialogue on equal footing, consensus building through consultation. We see this right now very nicely in the Chinese peace approach for the Russia-Ukrainian war, which actually asks Ukraine and Russia to come to a table and start discussions without any preconditions. And then comes the third point, where China is simply saying that all subgroups or multilateral initiatives, which are based on a broader set of values beyond the UN Charter, should be understood as fake or pseudo multilateralist, because they're already implementing a normative setting, and that is understood as being directed by elitists groups in the global system. I mean, the Chinese narrative is right now the United States, which are trying to superimpose their normative setting, their ideas, their power on other players. So we have here a Chinese version of multilateralism, which requires only a very minimal consensus on shared norms. And otherwise, we have a very, very strong concept of independent sovereign states. If you look at recent initiatives by China to establish multilateral alliances, you find exactly this pattern. Here, just three major initiatives by China in the recent years. You have the Global Development Initiative, and it's got all very lofty goals. All that sounds very, very nice, but you see, it's very broad, and it does not really require shared values. The Global Civilization Initiative has just been started a week ago. Yeah, so we have a Global Development Initiative, which actually is something like the follow-up to the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative in a new global setting is a Global Development Initiative. You have a Global Security Initiative, which is also an answer to recent developments in Russia and in Europe. And then the Global Civilization Initiative, which is designed to provide China with additional leverage in the global system and say and influence in this system. Let me now try to look at what the reality of all these Chinese initiatives is. I call it hub and spoke bilateral or multilateral approach, because if you look at China's most recent multilateral initiatives, then you see not really a multilateral level playing field where we have a lot of independent players which are symmetric in their power and in their rights in this group, but you see rather an asymmetric system where you have China in the center as the most powerful, most influential player, and then you've got a periphery of secondary powers, secondary states, which are connected in this system by a hub and spoke system to the central China. So you have China with a central role. You have hardly any horizontal institution building amongst the whole group of these independent or equal partners. And the whole system is, as I said, constructed as a hub and spoke system where China is first of all upholding bilateral relationships with other players. So take the Belt and Road Initiative. You have 145 members or 105 145 actors which have signed MOUs, or contractual arrangements with China. It's all contractual arrangements with China. It's not contractual arrangements with a multilateral group or any organization. There's also no real horizontal platform for 145 players, but it's really a setup of bilateral relations. The same for the by now more or less non-existent 16 or 17 plus 1 group between China and a group of Eastern European countries. They are all based on the idea of China playing an asymmetric role, where China is making use of superior power to assert its particular interest and is distributing goodies. No question about that. So these are groups where members are profiting. China is distributing goodies, no question about that, by means of its, got a problem with the technology today, sorry about that. By means of its economic and technological leadership, its financial power, which has been quite a lure in recent years, especially for the Belt and Road member countries, etc., etc. But at the same time, this has allowed China to leverage its own economic power to establish something like a standardization process, a promulgation of Chinese norms, standards, technological standards especially, and the creation of a new sphere of interest and of a little bit more Chinese institutions than in the rest of the global system. So the question is, if this Chinese style of true multilateralism, as they call it, is not eventually creating exactly the same type of subgroups and blocks that China is condemning the West to create by its own multilateralist approach. Okay. I leave this. I'm not going to answer that, but I'm just leaving this for discussion. Now, trying to connect this whole thing with the notion of populism. Let's simply start with China's true multilateralism and domestic populism. How is it sold to the domestic populace? Well, China is presenting itself in its own propaganda at home as an heroic knight, which is fighting against the almighty evil power, which is, of course, the United States. And, of course, that has a very nice side effect that anything which does not work out, any negative development, missed goals, etc., may be attributed to this overwhelming external power against which China is fighting. Yeah, so it strengthens Chinese identity building. At the same time, this concept is putting China on the moral high ground. It strengthens, it's used, it's employed to strengthen the people's belief in China's supremacy. 5,000 years of uninterrupted cultural achievements. Once again, paying into the idea of Chinese identity building. Of course, it does pave the way for the promotion of Chinese business and economic interests, at least in some parts of the international arena, and is thereby strengthening the domestic economy and material basis of the people, at least in principle. And what we should not forget, most of these initiatives, like the Belt and Road Initiative, like the Global Development Initiative, etc., may be understood as international extensions of the CCP's, Communist Party's core populist and national programs, which have been set up in the domestic context. So if we talk about the China Dream, Xi Jinping thought, etc., etc., these are deeply populist nationalist programs, and their international dimension is being created by these true multilateral approaches or innovations China is introducing to the global system. And then finally, the notion of China's true multilateralism and populism on a global scale. My idea here is that we have here a constellation where China is communicating its true multilateralism as a concept of the global South, which is providing an alternative to the elitist Western multilateralism. And the latter is, of course, set to establish elite clubs. It's erecting protectionist barriers against the globe's underdogs, is reintroducing bloc building, Cold War rhetoric, is not taking care of the real needs, of the real requirements of the poor people of the world, etc., etc. So if you look at what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years with the reinvigoration, revitalization of the BRICS concept, I think that pays in nicely to this argument, where China is trying to promote this idea that we need, that the world, the poor people of the world need global alliances, multilateral settings, which can start without this strong set of values, of norms and standards, but start at the very beginning and provide a forum for these underdogs to deal and fight with these elitist powers, which are keeping them down and stop their economic and social development. I mean, this is the other major narrative China is promulgating right now, that the United States is trying to stop its economic rise and is stopping the Chinese people from trying to stop the Chinese people from achieving the welfare and power status they deserve.
5 minutes.
1 minute. This is part of this is a quote of Xi Jinping at the Bao'an Forum, a major economic policy meeting in southern China, with stating very clearly a lot of unrest, division, and poverty have been created in different parts of the world under practices of prioritizing one country's interests, making coteries that uphold hegemony, and treating international rules as a tool for the interests of one nation, using a certain country's interests as the criteria, and engaging in selective multilateralism. I mean, this is clearly directed against the United States, and is opening the doors for true multilateralism, where the global underdogs of the developing world is asked to join China and stand up against the global elite, which is located in Washington and in the European capitals. So China presents itself as a noble fighter for those who are out of favor of the all-powerful elite, and asserts their claim to an equal voice in all global affairs. So that's my idea, which I wanted to introduce to you here today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Marcus, for this interesting talk. Really interesting. Thank you all for the stimulating, interesting, and also important contributions. Before we come to the questions and answers block, I understand my task as moderator to be to place the articles or the talks in the context of the topic of the panel, which is the new globalization and countering populism. Also in the invitation letter, I was explicitly asked to deliver a speech on the specific topic of the new globalization and countering populism. However, given the time constraints, I will refrain from such a speech here, but I only will say a few sentences about my understanding of the topic and the classification of the lectures given. Given the specific topic of the panel, the new globalization in countering populism. Some listeners, including me, may have missed statements to clarify what exactly is meant by globalization versus new globalization. Here, we heard a lot about new forms of international cooperation. However, the question remains open to what extent this is to be understood as an expression of new globalization. In the macroeconomic, political economic sense, globalization is measured as the relative growth rate of international exchange activities in terms of international trade, international financial transactions, labor migration, exchange of knowledge and technologies in relation to GDP growth. In this respect, one cannot speak, for example, of trendy deglobalization, what some calls a new globalization in political economics. But one can speak of pauses, slight declines after the two mega crises, the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, with its disruption of credit and supply chains. Only a hot and, or at least cold war, in which China is also actively involved, would trigger this. Therefore, in this sense, there is no new globalization. But I guess that in the political science sense, the changes in the new forms of international cooperation and collaboration were more central here and have served to justify what is meant as new globalization. The first part of my comment. The second, and more importantly, we heard little in this panel about countering populism. That is, about the possibilities and appropriate measures for reacting to or pushing back populism. In addition, there is the question of the pros and cons of populism in the first place, where populism should really be evaluated as exclusively negative, as it is made out to be in most political science writings. In a recent article, I am currently addressing the question of what role populism plays for economic development, for poverty reduction in developing countries, as well as for overcoming the middle income trap in emerging countries. For example, I remember discussions when I was professor of economics at Princeton University in 1992. I gave a lecture at the politics department about stabilizing the transformation process in the Eastern European transformation countries. And we discussed a lot at this time, 30 years ago, about the role of such a kind of populist programs for stabilizing these countries. The economists never had this idea. When I argued about such ideas in another lecture at the economics department, people like Ben Bernanke, my colleague, told me what all this talk is about. Give them 20 or 40 billion dollars and everything will work out. No feeling, but in the politics department, there was still a feeling about the role of something like populist programs at the beginning of transformation programs. That's only an example for looking more differently at the topics. And the other one is middle income traps. In the last 6 years, I have dealt with the latter, the preconditions for overcoming the middle income trap in more than I think a dozen articles in academic journals and in a book entitled The Economic Rise of East Asia, the Development Path of Japan, South Korea, and China, published by Springer Publishing House. When I look at these from this, I cannot see any clear necessity, even in these countries, of the exclusively negative evaluation of populism for certain periods in the development, especially in transition countries. That's only was a personal comment on this topic. There's not a reproach to the speakers nor to the organizer. because you can only present what you have, and you can only put together in a panel what you are offered. Therefore, that's only personal feelings about this topic from the view of a macroeconomist and a political economist, not a political scientist. Now we have, I think, 20 minutes or so, I think 15 to 20 minutes left for the audience's discussion with the presenters. As I understood, the organizer gave me the restriction of first presenting, letting the presenters give their talks 3 times 20 minutes, and then bundle the questions in a 30 minutes questions and answer block. And we don't have, I think, 30 minutes anymore, but at least 20 minutes. The easiest way would be simply press the raise hand button, but I think better it is when you write your name and in addition question to X, Y, Z in the chat, then I know the order and the question to whom it is directed to. Okay, then I would ask you to put your questions in the chat. I saw there at least for each presenter is one question. Everybody can, I think, look at the questions in the chat. The first should be, the first was to Oscar. And the question was, what role do producers and intellectuals play in the increasing power of autocracy, and how are they affected by this trend? Can they prevent autocracy partially?
So I have 2 answers. So for the first answer is when you consider populism a kind of Manichaean discourse, ideology, rhetoric between enemies and friends, between people and elites, and you create a kind of division in the society. You try to impose as a political, in the political sphere, a kind of division, of course, an opposition, an antagonism. This narrative, of course, is opposed to another narratives. The narrative about citizenship, inclusive citizenship, and egalitarian citizenship. And this, of course, is implicit, because, of course, the relation is not just an opposition, but is an alternative narrative. And, of course, when you talk about autocracy, you talk about anti-democratic trend, and, of course, the idea to divide the society and the people between the serving and the serving people, the makers and the takers, the producers and the parasites. Of course, you don't talk about the rich and the poor. You don't talk about the people, they are right or not right. You introduce an alternative narrative, imposing your own. Of course, you are left-wing populism and right-wing populism. I don't know if everybody agree about this distinction, but I think it's important distinction. And this, I think, it's in this sense, producerism, the narrative of producerist, the producer narrative, is a kind of course, one of the condition to create a kind of pseudo-democratic, of anti-democratic vision of the society because if you don't contribute to the richness of your country, material richness of the country, you are not the servant member of the community, you can be discriminated, etc., etc., etc. So that's I think it's a very important point. And the second point is the question about our coordinator, the panel. I think the populism in this 80s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s was especially connected with the Latin American experience. Latin American experience with a low democratic, of course, system, and with a strong impact of the Keynesianism approach of economy. And I think when you look at the 90s and the 20th century, and the last 20 years, we have to consider the strong dominance of neoliberalism. And every right-wing populist party has to deal with that. On the one side, the protectionist, but also Trump is to some extent protectionist, at the same time neoliberal. And then you have the relation with neoliberalism is another kind of populism. The populism is based on the idea there are some people, they are more deserving than the others. And this aspect of neoliberalism really influenced, in my opinion, right-wing populist stances. And they introduced this dimension, they developed this dimension. And of course, another point for me crucial, because you look at the intellectuals. So the right-wing populist discourse is trying to create an alternative division, not between the people, they are meritant because they are educated, because this is the dominant discourse, mainstream discourse in our society. There are people that are good diploma, university diploma, they are meritant, they can be rich, etc., etc. This is the dominant discourse. We are all the member of this community of people. But the right-wing populists, when they look at the voters with low educated people, they say, you can be meritant without high educated diploma, without education. This is the idea, because you contribute to the prosperity, although you are not educated. That's the point. That's the point. And that's all these kind of discourses, narrative, are so powerful because they use the ambiguity and the contradiction of our society.
Okay, thank you, Oscar, for the answer. I hope you are satisfied, Dr. Grun. Put a question on the chat. Okay. Then we go to the second question. It's by Booland to Michael Lee. And it's a long question. Dear Professor Lee, is there a direct correlation between current understanding of liberalism in economic sense and available plutocratic systems, both at the national and global levels? I'm originally from Turkey, where the richest 1% of the population has 54% of national income. Do you think that this imbalance in income distribution is among the main reasons for rising populism? What do you think about the ideas of John Rawls, who demanded a strong revision of unsuccessful distributive skills of liberal systems for the sake of assuring social justice and fairness?
Oh, no, that's a really wonderful question. Thank you, Belen. I think absolutely, right. You need to understand, I certainly agree with Oscar, right. You can't fully understand the rise of populism, certainly right-wing populism, without understanding inequality. So I think first that we have to think about how this inequality came about, right? If we go back to the post-war order, at least in Europe and in North America, we had this era of embedded liberalism where inequality was much lower, right? You had the expansion, the creation of social democracies in much of Europe. The United States didn't quite go so far, but certainly the New Deal was an era where these kinds of things were expanded. And that came about in part with more and more civil society groups like unions advocating for these kinds of social programs. Neoliberalism emerges in the 1980s and takes power in part by conflicting with those civil society groups, right? The kind of classic, you think of Margaret Thatcher fighting the coal miners in Britain, Reagan firing the air traffic controllers when they go on strike. And you get a weakening of these kinds of civil society groups that used to do something very important, right? That they connected individuals in a very complex way, right? This is where I think a Tocquevillian understanding of populism can be useful. And so once you break down, you defeat those groups, you end up with a more atomized voter that is not connected with lots of different groups. And it's very easy to make them a very particular, a very narrow pitch of, perhaps using producerist language, right? That you are being screwed by the welfare state. So I think that's the first part of it, that the process through which neoliberalism emerged created an electorate that was vulnerable to kind of populist appeals. But secondly, now that inequality is so high, I think this creates anxiety, not just for the poor, but also for elites, right? I think elites right now, certainly post-2008 financial crisis, were terrified of large-scale redistribution. And they were thinking, that old argument of, well, let's just cut taxes and that will benefit everybody. It's harder to make that case after 2008, after the collapse of the financial system. And populism is a useful program, right-wing populism and welfare chauvinism, telling people that, the reason that you're broke is not that, the bankers took all kinds of risks and the economy collapsed. It's because immigrants are taking your job. That's, it's the classic bait and switch. And I think relevant to the question of, the question about Rawls, although this also speaks to Helmut's question about how to respond, I think there's a few things that are worth thinking about. I think Rawls is right in his prognosis that we should develop fair distributions. I think the challenge is that universality is a really, really hard sell for people. This is why welfare chauvinism has a lot of appeal, because you can get just enough people that you need to win the election, and you can offer them more. Whereas if your competitors are saying, well, we'll help everybody go up by this, that's a weaker argument than if you're saying to 50% of people, we'll help you go up by this much. I think the solution lies in designing institutions, both at the global level and the domestic level, that people feel meaningfully attached to. It involves building complex civil society organizations that connect people in such ways that individuals can mobilize, and so that it's difficult for populists to divide people through these kinds of stark, you're either one of the real people or you're a member of the anti-people, to minimize these kinds of stark divisions. And that's where you can kind of get around some of the particularism that populist leaders can use. And just briefly, this question about new globalization is very interesting. I would say all waves of globalization involve different clusters of flows, right? So the 19th century, you have a lot of trade, you have financial globalization, lots of migration. The 21st century actually in some ways is less integrated, right? The flow of people across borders is less intense, at least if you look at the Americas, than it was in the 19th century. Something that populism, a populist world order opens up, and this speaks a bit to Marcus's presentation, right? This Chinese vision of true multilateralism, I think, does open the door for certain kinds of cooperation, more of the sort of elite cooperation that you could imagine, a kind of like, we both have offshore accounts somewhere. I'll scratch my back if you scratch yours. There may be forms of cooperation that are possible in this world order, not necessarily in a way that is positive for ordinary people, but that this is something that we should be studying, not just the kinds of like large scale flows, economic flows, but also some of the other connections that could emerge in a more complex world order. But thank you so much for the questions.
Thank you for the answer.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I was told by Synapse that my voice is a bit low. That maybe that my internet is here not going very well today, and I have technical problems too. And
but we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, in addition, I have some throat infection. Therefore, maybe I'm also a little bit thin-voiced at the moment. We have a third question for Marcus. That question is by Ertugrul, and it's how does multilateralism promote the sharing of values and norms among countries, and what are some of the challenges and limitations to this process? Please,
Yeah.
Margaret.
Yeah, thank you, Tigrul. This is, of course, a very, very important question. I mean, actually, I have two types of answers, or two answers which are not yet fully connected. Actually, I have to think a little bit more about that. But my first spontaneous answer was, well, of course, I mean, whenever we talk about these multilateral systems, we talk a bit about different cultural setups. We have different belief systems. You know, people believe in different systems of true and false, good and evil. And so they come together and they strive to create joint public goods. And they can do that obviously only by bringing by joining forces and doing that. And the idea is simply you can do that only if you have a minimum of shared values. Without a minimum of shared values, you simply cannot create public goods. I understand this hub and spoke system rather as a system where not really a public good is created, but this what is created is actually something which is paying to the needs or the goals of the lead player, the asymmetric power. That would be China in that respect. And this asymmetric power is paying out goodies for the peripheral states. Okay, so this is my understanding would not be a system, a multilateral system where joint values and norms are being created. A multilateral system where values and norms are being shared or probably newly created would be one where a true public good is being created. And this creation, the capability of creating a joint public good, in my understanding, becomes more feasible the stronger the basis of shared values is. The stronger this basis is, the more you're capable to create public goods and create profit for everybody. And that should set up a virtuous circle where this group is coming closer and closer together, because they see by creating a larger and broader set of shared values, they become more productive. They become more effective in the creation of public goods, which increase the utility of all parties involved. So that would be my first answer. But then thinking for another 2 minutes, I thought, wow, that's a little bit too simplistic probably, because we are talking here, coming back to this idea Michael brought up right now, we are talking about here actually about elites which are working together. And just thinking about this old political science concept of two-level diplomacy, where you have elites or leadership groups which must cater to the needs of the domestic sphere. They are limited in the international agency by what is permissible in their domestic sphere. And that means we must see in how far these multilateral arrangements create incentives for these elites to change their behavior also towards in the domestic arena. And obviously we have a situation where populist autocracies have more leeway to construct their or design the leeway they have in their domestic arena. Once again, just take China. I mean, the Chinese elite, the Communist Party, has been quite positive towards participating in the Western style multilateral arrangements for as long as they've been in a catching up process. Being part of these multilateral organizations has paid off for the Chinese elite and has paid off for the Chinese people by means of market transformation, creating an economic miracle, etc., etc. And then a couple of years ago, the Xi Jinping regime had the impression, well, it's advantages for us to stop that, to get out of these arrangements. We can better promote our interests by disentangling from this kind of multilateral arrangements and go our own way. Yeah, and this is what we're seeing right now. Susan Shirk is calling that perhaps some overreach, that China is overconfident, is overestimating its own strength, its own power in being able to become a shaping power in the global system. But this is at least the shift which has happened in amongst which I guess we can observe in the Chinese elite, that they've been following the Western qualitative multilateral system for as long as they thought it pays off for them. Then they thought it does not pay off for us anymore. We can maximize our utility by shifting to another system. And now it's our job to convince Xi and his friends that coming back to the Western style of qualitative multilateralism is eventually promoting is promoting the goals, the mindset, the utility of the Chinese people. And I mean, we have seen some turning points. Michael mentioned that these financial crises. I mean, 2008, 2009 has been a very, very important turning point in Chinese policymaking, insofar as the liberal forces were pushed against the wall, and the hardliners, the anti-American, anti-liberal, anti-democratic forces got the upper hand and were able to say, hey, listen, the American system, the Western system is defunct, it's corrupted, it doesn't work, our system is better. We are right now perhaps in at another turning point with the Russian war, with the escalation in Taiwan, where actually the Chinese government, I mean, the Chinese elites, they are increasingly afraid of the ghosts they unleashed and cannot control anymore, to quote Goethe. They unleashed this ultra-nationalism amongst their own people. And now they're increasingly pushed into a position where they might be forced to do things vis-a-vis Taiwan, which is not really in the interests of mainland China. I'm talking here about military aggression. And I think we are looking forward to some really, really interesting 2 or 3 years, where I think the Chinese political setup will see some they have to make some decisions. Let's put it this way. Yeah. I don't know if this is answering your question. These are just some rambling thoughts.
Professor Marcus, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, for the interesting answer. We have still one comment and one question to Michael. Do we have still time, Ibrahim, or not?
Professor Wagner, unfortunately, we run out of time.
Okay.
And we have to move to our final keynote speech. I'm sorry for that.
No. Then sorry for, what is this? Nesilan, who put a question to Mike Lee. Maybe you can conversate privately then about the question. And thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would like to end the panel by thanking all the participants, especially, of course, the speakers for the participation in this panel. Thanks a lot.